King Alexander stood at the grand window of his private study, watching the morning mist roll across the palace gardens. At 62, his once golden hair had turned silver, and deep lines marked his weathered face, evidence of the heavy burden of ruling the kingdom of Valdoria for the past 3 decades. The ornate crown that had once felt light on his head now seemed to weigh more each passing day. Behind him, the heavy oak doors burst open without ceremony. Queen Isabel, his wife of 25 years, swept into the room with the grace that had first captured his heart. Her emerald silk gown rustled against the marble floor as she approached, but her usual warm smile was replaced by a look of concern. "Alexander, we need to discuss the Thornfield situation," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of her homeland, the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. "The rumors are spreading through the court like wildfire." The king turned from the window, his steel blue eyes meeting his wife's worried gaze. The Thornfields had been a source of tension for months now. Lady Margaret Thornfield, Isabel's younger sister, had always been the more spirited of the two sisters. Where Isabel possessed diplomatic grace, Margaret wielded sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. Their brother, Lord Edmund Thornfield, served as the kingdom's treasurer, a position that had grown increasingly important as Valdoria faced economic challenges. "What exactly are they saying?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew. Isabel moved to the ornate chair beside his desk, her fingers nervously adjusting the pearl necklace at her throat. "They're saying that Margaret and Edmund have been questioning your recent policies openly. Yesterday, during the council meeting, Margaret apparently stood up and challenged Lord Chancellor Blackwood about the new taxation measures. She called them burdensome to the common folk and beneficial only to the noble houses." Alexander's jaw tightened. The taxation measures had been his idea, crafted carefully with his most trusted advisors to address the kingdom's mounting debt. The kingdom had been struggling financially ever since the failed trade agreement with the Eastern Territories, and difficult decisions had to be made. "She spoke out of turn," he said, his voice carrying the weight of royal displeasure. "The council chamber is not a place for theatrical displays." "But, Alexander, she wasn't wrong," Isabel said softly. "You know as well as I do that the common people are struggling. The harvest was poor last year, and now with these new taxes—" "Enough," Alexander interrupted, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. He had always prided himself on maintaining composure, even in the most challenging situations. "I will not have my decisions questioned by members of my own family, especially not in front of the entire court." Isabel rose from her chair, moving closer to her husband. "They're my family, Alexander. Margaret may be headstrong, but she cares deeply about this kingdom, and Edmund has always been loyal to the crown. Perhaps if you spoke with them privately—" "I've made my decision," Alexander said, turning back to the window. "I cannot allow dissent within my own household to undermine the stability of the realm. The people look to the royal family for unity and strength." The queen's face paled. "What are you saying?" Before Alexander could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the chamber. "Enter," he called. Captain Harrison Blackthorne, head of the Royal Guard, stepped into the room. His tall, imposing figure was dressed in the ceremonial blue and gold uniform of the Guard, complete with the golden lion crest of Valdoria emblazoned on his chest. At 38, Harrison had served the royal family faithfully for 15 years, rising through the ranks due to his unwavering loyalty and tactical brilliance. "Your Majesty," Harrison said with a crisp bow, "you requested to see me." Alexander straightened his shoulders, assuming the authoritative posture that had served him well throughout his reign. "Captain Blackthorne, I need you to prepare an official decree. Effective immediately, Lord Edmund Thornfield and Lady Margaret Thornfield are to be banned from all palace grounds and stripped of their court privileges." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabel gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Alexander, no. They're my siblings." Harrison's expression remained professionally neutral, though a flicker of surprise crossed his features. "Your Majesty, may I ask the specific charges?" "Sedition and undermining royal authority," Alexander replied curtly. "They have repeatedly questioned my decisions in public forums and have been spreading discontent among the nobility. I will not tolerate such behavior, regardless of their family connections." Isabel stepped forward, her composure beginning to crack. "You cannot be serious. Margaret may have spoken rashly, but Edmund has served this kingdom faithfully for over a decade. He's helped stabilize our finances through some of the most difficult periods in our history. And now he's become part of the problem," Alexander said, his voice cold. Their influence has become toxic to the stability of the court. Harrison cleared his throat carefully. Your Majesty, implementing such a decree will require careful consideration of the legal precedents. The Thornfields hold hereditary titles and significant holdings within the kingdom. Their titles will remain, but their access to the palace and their positions within the court are forfeit, Alexander declared. I want them gone by nightfall tomorrow. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Isabel's breathing had become shallow, and her face had taken on an alarming pallor. The magnitude of what her husband was proposing began to sink in. This wasn't just a political maneuver. It was the destruction of her relationship with her family. Alexander, please, she whispered. Think about what you're doing. Margaret and Edmund raised me after our parents died. They're all the family I have left from Astoria. You're asking me to choose between my crown and my blood. The king's expression softened slightly as he looked at his wife's distressed face. For a moment, the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to ease, and the man who had fallen in love with a young princess from a neighboring kingdom emerged from behind the royal mask. Isabel, my love, you know I would never ask you to choose if there were any other way. But the stability of Aldoria must come first. Always. But they're my family, she repeated, her voice breaking. And I am your king, Alexander replied, the softness vanishing from his voice as quickly as it had appeared. Captain Blackthorne, you have your orders. Harrison bowed again, though his discomfort with the situation was evident. I will prepare the necessary documentation, Your Majesty. However, I must ask, are there any specific security concerns I should be aware of regarding the enforcement of this decree? Alexander considered the question carefully. Both Edmund and Margaret were well-liked among certain factions of the nobility, and their sudden banishment would undoubtedly cause ripples throughout the court. Post additional guards at all palace entrances, he instructed. I want a full security detail present when the decree is read. And, Harrison, I want this handled with dignity. They are still members of a noble house, even if they are no longer welcome here. Understood, Your Majesty. As Harrison turned to leave, Isabel suddenly swayed on her feet. The combination of shock, stress, and the tight corset beneath her gown had begun to affect her breathing. She reached out for the nearest chair, but missed, her legs giving way beneath her. Isabel. Alexander rushed to catch her as she collapsed, her emerald gown pooling around her on the marble floor. Her face had gone completely white, and her breathing had become rapid and shallow. Harrison immediately moved to assist, his military training kicking in. Should I summon the royal physician? Yes, immediately, Alexander commanded, cradling his wife's head in his lap. And send for her ladies-in-waiting. As Isabel's eyes fluttered closed, Alexander felt a stab of doubt pierce through his royal resolve. The woman in his arms had been his anchor for 25 years, his closest advisor and dearest friend. Yet here she was, collapsed from the shock of his decision to banish her beloved siblings. The ornate chamber, which moments before had been filled with the authority and power of royal decree, now felt empty and cold. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed harsh rather than warm, casting long shadows across the floor where the queen lay unconscious. Alexander looked down at Isabel's pale face and wondered if the price of royal authority was becoming too high to bear. But even as doubt crept into his mind, he knew he would not rescind his decision. The crown demanded sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices cut deeper than any sword ever could. In the distance, the palace bells began to chime the hour, their resonant tones echoing through the corridors where soon the news of the Thornfield banishment would spread like wildfire. The kingdom of Aldoria was about to face one of its greatest internal crises, and it all began with a king's decree and a queen's collapse in a sunlit chamber high above the palace gardens. Dr. Marcus Whitmore arrived at the royal chambers within minutes of being summoned, his medical bag in hand and his graying beard slightly disheveled from his hasty journey through the palace corridors. At 55, he had served as the royal physician for over 2 decades and had attended to the royal family through various ailments and crises. However, seeing Queen Isabel unconscious on the marble floor sent a chill through his experienced heart. What happened? He asked tersely, immediately kneeling beside the queen and checking her pulse. She collapsed after hearing some distressing news, Alexander replied, his voice tight with concern. He had carefully repositioned himself to cradle Isabel's head while Dr. Whitmore examined her. The physician's practiced hands moved quickly, checking her breathing and examining her pupils. Her pulse is rapid but steady. This appears to be a combination of shock and physical stress. Has she been eating properly? Sleeping well? Alexander's brow furrowed as he considered the question. Now that he thought about it, Isabel had been picking at her meals lately and had mentioned difficulty sleeping. The pressures of recent months, the kingdom's financial troubles, the growing unrest among the nobility, and now the conflict with her family, had clearly taken a greater toll than either of them had realized. She's been under considerable strain, Alexander admitted. Dr. Whitmore nodded grimly. I need to get her to her chambers immediately. Your Majesty, I'll need you to help me move her to her bed. As they carefully lifted the queen, her eyes fluttered open. Alexander, she whispered, disoriented. I'm here, my love, he said softly, his royal composure momentarily forgotten in his concern for his wife. The decree. She began, memory flooding back. Don't concern yourself with that now, Dr. Whitmore interjected firmly. You need rest. They carried her to the royal bedchamber, where her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Catherine Morrison and Lady Sarah Blackwood, were already waiting with worried expressions. The ornate four-poster bed, with its rich burgundy curtains and golden tassels, seemed to dwarf Isabel's pale form as they settled her against the silk pillows. I want everyone except Dr. Whitmore to leave, Alexander commanded. The queen needs quiet. As the ladies-in-waiting reluctantly withdrew, Dr. Whitmore began his more thorough examination. Your Majesty, he said to Alexander, I need to speak with you privately about the queen's condition. They moved to the sitting area of the royal suite, where tall windows offered a view of the palace gardens below. In the distance, Alexander could see gardeners tending to the rose bushes that Isabel loved so much, a reminder of happier, simpler times. The queen is physically and emotionally exhausted, Dr. Whitmore began. Her collapse today was her body's way of forcing her to rest. But I'm concerned about more than just this incident. She's lost weight, and there are signs of chronic stress that have been building for some time. Alexander sank into a velvet armchair, suddenly, feeling every one of his 62 years. What are you saying, doctor? I'm saying that the queen needs extended rest and freedom from whatever stresses have been affecting her. If she continues at this pace, under this level of strain, her health could seriously deteriorate. The irony was not lost on Alexander. The very decree that had caused Isabel's collapse was something he believed necessary for the kingdom's stability, yet it was destroying the stability of his own household. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Captain Harrison Blackthorne was carrying out his orders with military precision, though his heart was heavy with the task. He had spent the afternoon drafting the official decree and preparing his guards for what would undoubtedly be a difficult evening. The Thornfield siblings had been summoned to the palace that afternoon for what they believed was a routine council meeting. Lord Edmund Thornfield arrived first, his tall, lean figure dressed impeccably in the dark blue velvet coat that marked his position as royal treasurer. At 43, Edmund possessed the same sharp intellect as his sister Margaret, but tempered with the diplomatic skills that had made him invaluable to the crown for over a decade. Lady Margaret Thornfield swept into the palace an hour later, her vibrant red hair perfectly arranged despite the autumn wind outside. At 39, she was still considered one of the most beautiful women at court, but it was her quick wit and fearless advocacy for the common people that had earned her both admirers and enemies among the nobility. Neither sibling suspected what awaited them. Harrison found them in the smaller council chamber, reviewing financial documents for the upcoming budget meetings. Edmund was pointing to various figures on a parchment while Margaret listened intently, occasionally offering suggestions. Lord Edmund, Lady Margaret. Harrison announced his presence with a formal bow. Captain Blackthorne, Edmund responded, looking up from his papers. I wasn't expecting to see you today. Is there a security matter that requires our attention? Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm here on direct orders from His Majesty. I must ask you both to accompany me to the throne room immediately. Margaret's green eyes, so similar to her sister Isabel's, narrowed with suspicion. The throne room? What's this about, Harrison? I am not at liberty to discuss the matter here, Harrison replied, his formal tone doing little to mask his discomfort. Please, if you would follow me. The walk through the palace corridors felt interminable. Edmund and Margaret exchanged worried glances but said nothing, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Servants and courtiers they passed seemed to avoid making eye contact, and Margaret noticed several whispered conversations that stopped abruptly as they approached. The throne room of Valdoria was a magnificent chamber designed to inspire awe and respect. Soaring columns supported a vaulted ceiling decorated with murals depicting the kingdom's greatest victories. The golden throne itself sat atop a raised dais, flanked by the banners of the kingdom's noble houses. Today, however, the room felt cold and forbidding. King Alexander sat upon his throne, wearing the full regalia of his office, the crown of Valdoria, the royal scepter, and the ceremonial robes that emphasized the power and authority of his position. Lord Chancellor Blackwood stood to his right, holding an official scroll sealed with the royal seal. Lord Edmund Thornfield and Lady Margaret Thornfield. Harrison announced formally, "You stand before His Royal Majesty, King Alexander of Valdoria." Both siblings bowed deeply, though Margaret's curtsy was notably less elaborate than court protocol typically demanded. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, his voice respectful but puzzled. "We were told you wished to see us urgently." Alexander's expression was stern and unforgiving. "Lord Edmund, Lady Margaret, you have been brought here to answer for your recent conduct, which has been deemed detrimental to the stability and authority of the crown." Margaret's eyes flashed with defiance. "What conduct?" "Speaking the truth about policies that are harming our people." "Silence." Alexander's voice boomed through the chamber. "You will not speak unless given permission." Lord Chancellor Blackwood stepped forward, unrolling the scroll. "By royal decree of His Majesty King Alexander of Valdoria, Lord Edmund Thornfield and Lady Margaret Thornfield are hereby stripped of all court privileges and banned from all palace grounds, effective immediately." The words hit Edmund like a physical blow. His face went pale, and he took an involuntary step backward. "Your Majesty, surely there's been some mistake." "There is no mistake," Alexander interrupted coldly. "Your recent actions, questioning royal policy in public forums and inciting discord among the nobility, constitute acts of sedition against the crown." Margaret found her voice, though it shook with emotion. "Sedition? For caring about the welfare of our people? For questioning policies that will drive families into poverty? For undermining the authority of your king?" Alexander replied icily. Edmund, ever the diplomat, attempted to salvage the situation. "Your Majesty, if we have given offense, we humbly ask for the opportunity to make amends. I have served this crown faithfully for over a decade. Surely my record of service, your service is acknowledged, but cannot excuse your recent conduct," Alexander said. "The decree stands." Margaret's composure finally shattered. "You're destroying Isabel. How can you do this to your own wife? We're the only family she has left." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Alexander's face, but it was quickly suppressed. "The Queen understands the necessity of this decision." "Does she?" Margaret challenged. "Where is she, then? Why isn't she here to witness this travesty?" Alexander's silence spoke volumes, and both siblings immediately understood that their sister was not in agreement with this decision. Lord Chancellor Blackwood continued reading from the decree. "You have until sunset tomorrow to remove all personal belongings from any palace accommodations. You are forbidden from entering any palace grounds henceforth. Violation of this decree will result in immediate arrest." Edmund's shoulders sagged with the weight of the pronouncement. His life's work, his dedication to the kingdom's financial stability, his years of faithful service, all of it was being swept away in a moment. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "what of the kingdom's finances? The budget preparations, the trade negotiations with the Eastern Territories? I have knowledge and relationships that took years to build. New arrangements will be made." Alexander replied curtly. "Your successor will be appointed within the week." Margaret looked at her brother's devastated expression and felt rage building within her. "This is madness, Alexander. You're punishing loyalty and dedication because it doesn't come with blind obedience." "Captain Blackthorne," Alexander called, "escort Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret from the palace. Ensure they understand the terms of their banishment." As the guards moved to flank them, Edmund made one last desperate attempt. "At least let us see Isabel. Let us say goodbye to our sister." Alexander's expression remained unmoved. "The Queen is indisposed." Margaret's eyes filled with tears of frustration and grief. "You're a tyrant, Alexander. History will remember this day as the beginning of your downfall." "Remove them," Alexander commanded. As Harrison and his guards escorted the siblings from the throne room, their footsteps echoed through the vast chamber like a funeral dirge. The magnificent room, which had witnessed countless coronations, treaties, and celebrations throughout Valdoria's history, had now become the stage for a family's destruction. Alexander remained on his throne long after they had gone, staring at the empty doorway through which Isabel's siblings had disappeared from their lives forever. The crown on his head felt heavier than ever, and, for the first time in his reign, he wondered if the price of absolute authority was worth paying. The sun was setting over the kingdom of Valdoria, casting long shadows across the palace grounds as Edmund and Margaret Thornfield made their way through the corridors they had once walked with pride and purpose. Now, flanked by guards, their footsteps felt hollow and final. The golden light streaming through the tall windows seemed to mock their situation, beautiful yet cold. Captain Harrison Blackthorne led the escort, his face a mask of professional duty that barely concealed his personal discomfort with the task. Behind him walked Edmund and Margaret, their dignity intact despite the circumstances, followed by 4 additional guards who maintained a respectful distance. "I need to retrieve some personal items from my office," Edmund said quietly as they approached the wing that housed the Treasury Department. His voice was steady, but those who knew him well could detect the underlying tremor of devastation. Harrison nodded. "You have 1 hour to collect your belongings. Nothing related to official kingdom business may be removed." Edmund's office was a testament to his years of dedicated service. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, trade agreements, and financial records dating back to the beginning of his tenure. His desk, crafted from ancient oak, bore the scratches and ink stains of countless late nights spent balancing the kingdom's accounts and negotiating crucial trade deals. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching her brother carefully select personal items to take with him. A silver letter opener their father had given him, a small portrait of their family, a few books on economic theory that belonged to him personally. Each item he chose seemed to represent a piece of his identity being stripped away. 23 years, Edmund murmured, running his fingers along the edge of his desk. "I was barely 20 when King Alexander first appointed me as an assistant treasurer. I learned every aspect of this kingdom's finances, built relationships with merchants and nobles across 3 kingdoms. Margaret moved to stand beside her brother, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've served with honor, Edmund. No decree can change that. Can't it?" Edmund's laugh was bitter. "By this time next week, I'll be remembered as the treasurer who was banished for sedition. All those years of faithful service will be forgotten." As Edmund continued packing, Margaret wandered to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. In the distance, she could see the tower that housed the royal chambers where her sister was recovering from her collapse. The irony was not lost on her. Isabel was physically closer than she had been in hours, yet had never felt further away. "We need to find a way to reach her," Margaret said softly. Isabel would never agree to this if she were in her right mind. Harrison, who had been standing silently by the door, cleared his throat. "Lady Margaret, I must remind you that any attempt to contact the Queen or enter the royal quarters would be considered a violation of the decree." Margaret turned to face the captain, her green eyes blazing with determination. "And I must remind you, Captain Blackthorne, that before I was a band courtier, I was a loving sister. That bond doesn't disappear because a king writes it on a piece of parchment. Nevertheless, my orders are clear." Edmund closed the leather satchel he had been packing and straightened his shoulders. "Very well. I believe I have everything I need." As they left the treasury wing, word of the Thornfield banishment was already spreading through the palace like wildfire. Servants whispered in alcoves, courtiers gathered in small groups to discuss the implications, and noble families began to wonder if they too might fall from grace if they dared to question royal decisions. Lady Catherine Morrison, one of Queen Isabel's closest friends and ladies-in-waiting, had heard the rumors and was desperately trying to gain access to the Queen's chambers. She found Dr. Whitmore emerging from the royal suite, his expression grave. "Doctor, please, I must see the Queen," Catherine pleaded. "Is it true about her family?" Dr. Whitmore paused, weighing his words carefully. "The Queen is resting and should not be disturbed. As for other matters, I suggest you speak with His Majesty." "But surely she knows what's happening? She must be devastated." "Lady Catherine, I cannot discuss the Queen's condition or state of mind with anyone other than the royal family. I'm sure you understand." Catherine's face fell. She had served Isabel faithfully for 15 years, had been present at her wedding, had helped her through the loss of 2 pregnancies, and had celebrated with her during the kingdom's triumphs. To be shut out now, when Isabel needed support most, felt like a betrayal of their friendship. Meanwhile, in the lower halls of the palace, the Thornfield siblings were making their way toward the main entrance. The corridors that had once felt like home now seemed endless and hostile. Portraits of former kings and Queens gazed down at them with what felt like judgment, though their painted eyes had witnessed far greater scandals and tragedies throughout Valdoria's history. I keep expecting to wake up, Margaret said softly. This morning, our greatest concern was the upcoming harvest festival. Now we're being escorted from the palace like common criminals. Perhaps it's better this way, Edmund replied, though his words lacked conviction. Perhaps we've been too comfortable here, too insulated from the reality of what our people face. Don't, Margaret said sharply. Don't try to find nobility in this injustice. We were right to question those taxation policies, and we were right to speak up for the common folk. Alexander has let the crown corrupt him. As they approached the main entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows of a side corridor. It was Lord Chancellor Blackwood, his black robes making him appear almost spectral in the dimming light. Lord Edmund, Lady Margaret, he said with a bow that seemed more mocking than respectful. I wanted to personally ensure you understood the full implications of today's decree. Edmund's jaw tightened. Blackwood had never liked the Thornfield family, seeing them as obstacles to his own influence over the king. We understand perfectly, Lord Chancellor. Do you? Blackwood's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. Because I would hate for there to be any misunderstandings about your new status. You are no longer welcome in any official capacity within this kingdom. That includes any financial institutions, trade guilds, or noble houses that conduct business with the crown. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes flashing dangerously. Are you threatening us, Lord Chancellor? I'm merely clarifying the scope of your banishment, Blackwood replied smoothly. The king's justice is swift, but fair. You brought this upon yourselves with your seditious behavior. Seditious. Edmund's composure finally cracked. I dedicated my life to this kingdom's prosperity. I worked 18-hour days to pull Valdoria out of the financial crisis left by the previous administration. I negotiated trade deals that brought prosperity to thousands of families. If that's sedition, then I'm proud to be guilty of it. Blackwood's expression remained unmoved. Your past service is acknowledged, but it doesn't excuse your recent rebellion against royal authority. Speaking truth to power isn't rebellion, Margaret said fiercely. It's duty. Your definitions differ from those of your king, Blackwood replied coldly. Captain Blackthorne, I believe your task is complete. Harrison nodded reluctantly. Lord Edmund, Lady Margaret, this is where we must part ways. As they reached the massive oak doors that marked the main entrance to the palace, Edmund turned for one last look at the home that had defined his adult life. The marble columns, the intricate tapestries, the golden lion crests that marked the authority of the crown, all of it would now be forbidden to him. Goodbye, Isabel, Margaret whispered, knowing her sister couldn't hear her, but needing to say the words anyway. The palace doors closed behind them with a resonant thud that seemed to echo through the gathering dusk. The Thornfield siblings stood on the grand steps, looking out at the cobblestone courtyard where their carriage waited to take them into exile. As their carriage rolled away from the palace, neither Edmund nor Margaret looked back. Behind them, the windows of the royal chamber glowed warmly in the darkness, where Queen Isabel was slowly awakening from her medically induced rest, unaware that her family had been torn apart while she lay unconscious. Inside the palace, King Alexander stood at his study window, watching the carriage disappear into the night. The deed was done, the decree enforced, and his authority maintained. Yet instead of satisfaction, he felt only a hollow emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing moment. Dr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway. Your Majesty, the Queen is awake and asking for you. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of his marriage. How much does she know? She remembers the conversation about the decree, but she's been unconscious during its implementation. I believe she hopes that some accommodation was reached. There was no accommodation, Alexander said firmly. The decree stands. Your Majesty, Dr. Whitmore said carefully, the Queen's emotional state is quite fragile. The shock of learning that her siblings have actually been banished could cause another collapse, potentially more serious than the first. Alexander felt the weight of the crown pressing down on him like never before. Doctor, I am the king of this realm. My first duty is to the crown and to the stability of Valdoria. Personal feelings cannot override that responsibility. Of course, Your Majesty. I merely wanted you to be aware of the potential consequences. As Alexander made his way to the royal chambers, he passed servants who bowed deeply but avoided meeting his eyes. The atmosphere in the palace had changed subtly but noticeably. Where once there had been warm respect, now there was cautious fear. The Thornfield banishment had sent a clear message throughout the court. No one was safe from royal displeasure, regardless of their service or their relationship to the crown. The message had been received, but at what cost? As Alexander approached the door to face his wife's inevitable heartbreak, he began to wonder if the price of absolute authority might be the very soul of his kingdom. Queen Isabel's eyes fluttered open to find the royal bedchamber bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Her head felt heavy, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why she felt so weak. The silk sheets beneath her were damp with perspiration, and her mouth was dry as parchment. Slowly, the events of the morning began to return to her. Alexander's announcement, the devastating decree, and then darkness. "Alexander," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The sitting area of their chamber was empty, but she could hear muffled voices beyond the door. As consciousness fully returned, so did the crushing weight of what had transpired. Her siblings, her beloved Edmund and spirited Margaret, were to be banished from the palace. The reality hit her like a physical blow, and she struggled to sit up against the pillows. The chamber door opened, and Alexander entered, his face grave and tired. He had removed his formal robes and crown, but even in his simpler attire, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man bearing an enormous burden. Behind him, Dr. Whitmore hovered uncertainly in the doorway. "Thank you, Doctor," Alexander said without turning. "That will be all for now." Dr. Whitmore hesitated. "Your Majesty, I should remind you that the Queen needs rest and should avoid any additional stress." "I said that will be all," Alexander repeated firmly. The physician bowed reluctantly and withdrew, closing the door behind him with unusual gentleness. Isabel watched her husband approach the bed, searching his face for any sign that the events of the morning had been nothing more than a terrible nightmare. "The decree," she said simply. "Tell me you changed your mind." Alexander's silence was answer enough. He moved to the chair beside her bed, the same chair where he had sat through countless nights when she had been ill, where they had shared quiet conversations about their hopes and fears for the kingdom. Tonight, it felt like an insurmountable distance separated them. "It's done, Isabel," he said quietly. "They left the palace an hour ago." The words struck her like a physical blow. She had held on to the desperate hope that somehow, during her unconsciousness, cooler heads had prevailed. That Alexander had remembered the man she fell in love with, the one who valued justice and compassion over rigid authority. "You sent them away while I was unconscious," she said, her voice barely containing her anguish. "You didn't even let me say goodbye." "It was necessary," Alexander replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Your emotional state was already fragile. Seeing them leave would have only made things worse." "Made things worse." Isabel's voice rose, and she struggled to sit up straighter. "Alexander, you've just destroyed the most important relationships in my life. How could things possibly be worse?" "You need to understand the position I was in," Alexander said, leaning forward. Edmund and Margaret's behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. They were undermining royal authority in front of the entire court. If you had allowed it to continue, you might have learned something," Isabel interrupted, her usual diplomatic composure cracking completely. "Edmund has served this kingdom faithfully for over 20 years. His financial expertise has pulled us through 3 major economic crises. And Margaret, for all her sharp tongue, has been one of the few voices in court willing to speak for the common people." "And that's precisely the problem," Alexander said, his own frustration beginning to show. "They weren't speaking for the crown. They were speaking against it." Isabel stared at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. "When did you become so afraid of dissent, Alexander? When did you start seeing loyalty and honest counsel as threats to your authority?" The question hit closer to home than Alexander cared to admit. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the view of the palace gardens was now shrouded in darkness. "I'm not afraid of dissent. I'm protecting the stability of the realm." "You're protecting your pride," Isabel said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "My siblings questioned your policies because those policies are hurting people. The new taxation measures are indeed burdensome to families who are already struggling. Edmund showed you the reports. Agricultural output is down, trade revenues are declining, and now you want to increase taxes on those least able to afford them." Alexander's shoulders tensed. "Those measures are temporary and necessary. The kingdom faces significant debt from the failed trade negotiations with the Eastern Territories. Difficult decisions must be made." "But at what cost?" Isabel demanded. You've banished two of your most capable advisors because they dared to suggest alternatives. What happens now when other nobles see what befell Edmund and Margaret? Will anyone dare to offer you honest counsel, or will they simply tell you what they think you want to hear? The accusation stung because it contained more truth than Alexander wanted to acknowledge. Even now, he could remember the way the other council members had fallen silent after Edmund's banishment was announced. The vibrant debate that had once characterized council meetings would likely be replaced by cautious agreement and fearful deference. I will not have my authority questioned in public forums, Alexander said. But his voice lacked its earlier fire. Your authority was never in question, Isabel replied. Your judgment was. And there's a difference, though you seem unable to see it. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, intending to stand, but dizziness immediately overwhelmed her. Alexander moved quickly to steady her, his hands gentle on her arms. You need to rest, he said softly. I need to see my family, she countered, but her body betrayed her words as she swayed unsteadily. Isabel, please. You collapsed earlier. Dr. Whitmore says you're suffering from exhaustion and stress. This argument isn't helping. She looked up into his face, seeing the concern there, but also the immovable resolve that had defined his reign. This isn't an argument, Alexander. It's the end of everything we built together. The words hung in the air between them like a curse. Alexander felt something cold and final settle in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that the man I married would never have torn a family apart to prove a point. The man I married understood that strength comes from wisdom, not from the ability to silence opposition. Tears began to flow down her cheeks. Where is that man, Alexander? What have 25 years on the throne done to him? Alexander's jaw tightened. That man learned that sentiment and good intentions aren't enough to rule a kingdom. That man learned that sometimes a king must make choices that hurt the people he loves in order to protect the realm he serves. And what good is a realm if it's built on fear and broken families? The question struck at the heart of Alexander's deepest insecurities about his reign. He had always prided himself on being a just and fair ruler, but the increasing challenges facing Valdoria had made him more rigid, more suspicious of dissent, more willing to see opposition as betrayal. I've dedicated my life to this kingdom, he said quietly. Every decision I make is weighed against the good of Valdoria. I can't let personal feelings compromise that responsibility. Personal feelings? Isabel's voice broke. Alexander, we're not talking about some distant diplomatic consideration. We're talking about my family. The people who raised me, who loved me, who have been part of our lives for decades. And you've cast them out like criminals. She struggled to her feet again, this time managing to stay upright despite her weakness. I need to know, was this really about their questioning your policies? Or was it about proving that not even the Queen's family is beyond your reach? The accusation was so sharp, so accurate in its assessment of his motivations, that Alexander felt a flash of anger. How dare you suggest, how dare I? Isabel's voice rose to match his. How dare you force me to choose between my crown and my family? How dare you make that choice for me while I lay unconscious and helpless? The royal bedchamber, which had been their private sanctuary for so many years, now felt like a battlefield. The very air seemed charged with the electricity of their conflict, and both realized that their marriage had reached a critical juncture from which there might be no return. I am your king, Alexander said, falling back on the authority that had always been his ultimate trump card in any dispute. And I am your wife, Isabel replied, her voice steady despite her tears. Or at least I was. I'm no longer certain what that means in this new world you've created. Alexander felt the foundation of his life shifting beneath his feet. Isabel had been his anchor for 25 years, the one person who could reach the man behind the crown. But now, looking at her devastated face, he wondered if he had sacrificed that connection on the altar of royal authority. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to rescind the decree, Isabel said without hesitation. I want you to bring my family home and apologize for this travesty of justice. I can't do that. Can't or won't. Alexander's silence was answer enough. Isabel nodded slowly, as if she had expected this response but had hoped against hope for a different outcome. Then, I have a choice to make, she said quietly. What choice? Isabel moved to her dressing table, where a small portrait of her family sat among her jewelry boxes. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the painted faces of Edmund and Margaret. The choice between being your queen and being their sister. Alexander's heart seemed to stop. Isabel, you can't mean, I mean exactly what you think I mean, she replied, not turning to face him. You've made it clear that there's no room in your kingdom for people who put family loyalty above blind obedience to the crown. Very well. Then, there's no room for me. The threat hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Alexander realized that his decree against the Thornfield family had set in motion a chain of events that threatened to destroy not just his relationship with his in-laws, but his marriage itself. And perhaps, ultimately, his very soul as both a king and a man. The words struck Alexander like lightning. For 25 years, through wars, political crises, personal losses, and the daily weight of ruling a kingdom, Isabel had been his constant companion. Now she stood before him, holding the portrait of her siblings, essentially threatening to abandon everything they had built together. You cannot be serious, Alexander said, though his voice carried more desperation than authority. You would abandon your people, your crown, your duty, for them? Isabel turned to face him fully, and Alexander was shocked by the transformation in her appearance. The woman who had collapsed hours earlier from shock and exhaustion now stood with a steel-backed determination that reminded him powerfully of why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. Don't you dare speak to me about duty, she said, her voice quiet but lethal. I have spent 25 years at your side, supporting every decision, defending every policy, standing by you through every crisis. I bore the losses of our children in silence so as not to burden the kingdom with our personal grief. I smiled at state dinners when my heart was breaking. I played the perfect queen while my own dreams withered away. And now you question my understanding of duty. Alexander recoiled as if slapped. They had never spoken of their lost pregnancies, 2 miscarriages in the early years of their marriage that had devastated them both, but which they had borne in private, maintaining their public composure for the good of the kingdom. That's not what I meant, he said weakly. Isn't it? Isabel moved closer to him, her green eyes blazing with years of suppressed resentment. Because from where I stand, it seems like my duty has always been to sacrifice anything and everything personal for the good of your kingdom. My homeland, my family, my own desires, all of it secondary to the crown. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't just about the Thornfield banishment anymore. This was about decades of accumulated grievances, small sacrifices that had built into an insurmountable wall between them. Isabel, you knew what marriage to me would mean. You knew the crown came first. I knew, she agreed. But I also believed that the man I loved would find ways to honor both his duty to the kingdom and his love for his family. I never imagined he would become so consumed with power that he would destroy the innocent to prove a point. A sharp knock at the chamber door interrupted their confrontation. Alexander's first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking persisted with an urgency that demanded attention. Enter, Alexander called reluctantly. Captain Harrison Blackthorne stepped into the room, his face grim. Behind him was Lady Catherine Morrison, who had clearly been crying. Your Majesty, Harrison began. Forgive the interruption, but there's been a development regarding the Thornfield situation. Isabel spun toward them, hope flickering in her eyes. What kind of development? Harrison glanced uncertainly between the king and queen, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of their marital crisis. Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret were attacked on the road approximately 3 miles from the palace. Their carriage was surrounded by a group of masked men. Attacked? Isabel's face went white. Are they hurt? They're alive, Harrison said quickly, but both sustained injuries. Lord Edmund was struck in the head with a club and is currently unconscious. Lady Margaret has a broken arm and several cuts from broken glass when the carriage window was shattered. Alexander's mind raced. Bandits? That was our initial assumption, Harrison replied. But the attackers seemed more interested in delivering a message than stealing valuables. They left Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret on the roadside with a note. What did it say? Alexander demanded. Harrison produced a piece of parchment from his coat. It read, "Thus to all who defy the crown. The king's justice has many arms." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Isabel staggered backward, her hand flying to her throat. Alexander felt as if the floor had opened beneath him. You think I ordered this? Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. I think, Harrison said carefully, that someone wants it to appear that way. The attack was too convenient, too perfectly timed to be coincidental. Someone wanted to send a very specific message. Lady Catherine stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. Your Majesty, there are already rumors spreading through the kingdom. People are saying that the royal guards followed the Thornfields and that this was done on your orders. Isabel sank into the nearest chair, the full horror of the situation washing over her. My God, Alexander, what have we done? What have you done? Alexander's mind worked furiously. The attack had to be the work of someone who wanted to destroy not just the Thornfield family, but his own reputation as well. Someone who would benefit from making him appear to be a tyrant who resorted to violence against his own family. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, Alexander said suddenly. Where is he? Harrison's expression darkened. That's what I was hoping you could tell me, Your Majesty. He left the palace shortly after the Thornfields departed, claiming he had urgent business in the city. No one has seen him since. The pieces began falling into place with terrible clarity. Blackwood had always resented the Thornfield family's influence, particularly Edmund's role as treasurer, which gave him significant power over the kingdom's finances. With the siblings banished, Blackwood would be in a perfect position to recommend his own allies for key positions. He orchestrated this, Alexander said, his voice filled with dawning horror. The attack, the note. He wanted to make it appear that I ordered violence against my own family. But why? Isabel asked, though she was beginning to understand the scope of the betrayal. Power, Alexander replied grimly. With Edmund gone, and me branded a tyrant, Blackwood becomes indispensable. He controls the narrative, controls the court's reaction, controls everything. Harrison nodded. It's worse than that, Your Majesty. The rumors spreading through the kingdom paint you as a king who not only banishes family members for minor disagreements, but then orders them beaten and left for dead. There are already whispers of rebellion among some of the noble houses. Isabel stood slowly, her face now set with grim determination. Where are Edmund and Margaret now? We brought them to Dr. Whitmore's private clinic in the city, Harrison replied. He's treating their injuries, but Lord Edmund's head wound is serious. He may not survive. The words hit Isabel like a physical blow. She swayed on her feet, and for a moment Alexander thought she might collapse again. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and moved toward her wardrobe. I'm going to them, she announced. Isabel, no, Alexander said immediately. It's not safe. If Blackwood is behind this, he may have planned for, I don't care. Isabel cut him off. My brother may be dying, and my sister is alone and afraid. I should have been with them from the beginning. She began pulling traveling clothes from her wardrobe, her movements sharp and decisive. Alexander watched helplessly as his wife prepared to leave the palace, and possibly him, forever. Your Majesty, Harrison said quietly, there's something else. The people gathering outside the palace gates are demanding answers. Word of the attack has spread quickly, and they want to know if the rumors are true. Alexander felt the walls of his reign closing in around him. In the space of 12 hours, he had gone from a respected king dealing with a minor family dispute to a potential tyrant whose own people questioned his basic humanity. I have to rescind the decree, he said suddenly. Publicly, I have to make it clear that I never ordered any violence. That won't be enough, Isabel said without turning from her packing. The damage is done. Even if you clear your name regarding the attack, you still banished my family for speaking the truth. You still chose pride over justice. Alexander watched his wife pack her belongings and felt 25 years of marriage, of partnership, of love, slipping through his fingers like sand. What can I do to fix this? Isabel paused in her packing, her back still turned to him. You can remember who you used to be. You can remember that being a king doesn't require abandoning your humanity. And you can pray that my brother survives your decree. As she turned to face him, Alexander saw in her eyes something he had never seen before. A complete loss of faith in the man she had once loved without reservation. I'm going to Edmund and Margaret, she said. I don't know when, or if, I'll return. Isabel, please. Let me come with you. Let me help. No, she said firmly. You've helped enough. Captain Harrison stepped forward. Your Majesty, I'll arrange a discreet escort for the Queen. And I suggest we begin an immediate investigation into Lord Chancellor Blackwood's whereabouts and activities. Alexander nodded numbly, watching as Isabel finished packing a small bag. The woman who had entered this chamber as his wife was leaving as something else entirely, a sister determined to stand by her wounded family, regardless of the cost. As Isabel moved toward the door, she paused and looked back at her husband one last time. The man I married would have protected my family, not destroyed them. Until I see that man again, if I ever do, I cannot be your wife. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded to Alexander like the end of everything he had ever held dear. He was left alone in the royal chamber, surrounded by the trappings of absolute power that had cost him the only things that truly mattered. Outside, the bells of Valdoria began to toll. Whether in warning or mourning, Alexander could no longer tell. The kingdom he had tried so hard to protect through rigid authority was beginning to crumble around him. And, for the first time in his 25-year reign, King Alexander of Valdoria wondered if the crown was worth wearing at all. In the distance, the lights of Dr. Whitmore's clinic flickered through the darkness, where a queen sat vigil beside her wounded brother, choosing family over crown, love over power, and truth over the terrible price of absolute authority. The kingdom of Valdoria had entered its darkest hour, and its king stood alone at the center of the storm he himself had created.